is Annabelle. I'm having trouble hearing. Am I on now?
Yes, you are on and we can hear you clearly. Thank you very much.
Uh, oh, good. Thank you. Yes, and thank you for allowing me to speak remotely. I certainly appreciate this, and I appreciate the invitation to talk about cybersecurity and the work that has been done, the work that I did when I was at the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the current work. Do you have the slides up available?
Yes, Annabelle, we do.
Okay. If you would go to slide 2. Okay, the current electric grid, and I'm sure a number of you know this, that the primary focus on today's grid is that there's the one-way flow of electricity, and from the market operations generation down to the customer use. As you can see, there's limited automation, limited situational awareness. Consumers are not able to manage their usage. Utilities have limited demand response. This is clearly changing. If you go to the next slide, please. The smart grid, or as some call it, grid modernization, the major difference is that you not only have the flow of electricity, but you also have flow of information. And the important difference also is you have two-way flow of electricity and two-way flow of information. You now are having distributed energy resources that may be islanded, that also link with local utilities. You have consumers, and that could be homeowners or industrial complex or buildings that generate their own electricity that they may sell back to in the U.S. and I'm sure in other countries around the world. There are requirements at times that there is significant peak load requirement that different locations and enterprises, customers, and so on are asked to reduce their energy usage, some of it voluntarily, some not. So there's a significant difference in how we are moving forward in modernizing the grid. And again, this is an international requirement to address the electricity needs. Also, as particularly in the U.S., as we add electric vehicles, we do not have sufficient capacity in our existing grid to meet our current requirements and then all the electrical vehicle requirements. So we are moving forward, and again, I will say this several times, this two-way flow of electricity and information is a significant move forward, significant advantage, but it does introduce potential vulnerabilities and potential issues. If you could go to the next slide, please. The drivers, again, that with climate change, energy security, life cycle, and jobs, we are looking at renewables, and I know that is an international area, wind and solar. The difficulty with wind and solar is that they do not function constantly. Wind goes up and down, the sun shines different time periods, and so utilities need to have sufficient capacity to address requirements from the consumers, even if the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. But you want to be able to use wind and solar, but adding those into the really the portfolio of each utility is critically important. We want to shift from oil to electric transportation. Again, we are looking at electric vehicles around the world, and those definitely are necessary to address our climate issues. Now, with all of that, we need to include all of this new technology, new capabilities, but ensuring reliability and security of the electric sector. So there are tremendous opportunities as we move forward, but also there are potential vulnerabilities and potential threats that we need to address. You can go to the next slide. And this is a document that was produced. It's in the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their framework, and it lists the major domains, markets, generation, customer distribution, transmission, service provider, and operations. One of the other major changes as we move forward is the interconnectedness of devices within a utility and interconnection of devices and systems across organizations and across utilities. For example, there are wind farms in the United States. Nevada has wind farms, West Virginia. They don't need all of that capacity. They are net exporters of electricity, and that means you have to get the electricity to the locations that need it. Excuse me. And so they have to sell it. All of these systems then need to be interconnected. And this means you need the information. So when you look at the internet here, how you handle the information from an organization, perhaps a utility in California that says, gee, it's the middle of summer and we need more, we're at our capacity, we need more resources from a utility that's outside of California. You have to have the communications capability to transmit all of those requests and then the system capabilities to transport that electricity to where it's needed. So this makes it a lot more complicated. And what it means is that some of the utilities that, particularly in the U.S., some of the smaller utilities, a municipality or cooperative that previously was basically a standalone utility, not interconnected to other utilities, other organizations. That is changing as we move forward in the future. On the customer end, customers now have the capability to manage their usage. Again, if it's a very hot summer day, they can, in their home, say, I'm not going to run the dryer, I'm not going to run my dishwasher that use a significant amount of electricity, and it's also can be very expensive. So customers also are managing their energy usage. To do this, they need to have the information from the utility for time of use prices, and then also to manage the devices in their home. So as we move forward and we interconnect all of these systems, then there are potential vulnerabilities and security issues. The other significant change is as we move forward, we are using the whole sector is moving to more commercially available protocols, commercially available applications and operating systems. There are those that will still be specific to the operational devices, the electric sector devices themselves, but all of this communication is using all of these commercial products. We are moving away from proprietary solutions and proprietary products. Now, there will still be legacy equipment, legacy devices, legacy protocols for probably another 2 or 3 decades. Those are not going to go away. But as we move forward and use all of these commercial applications, devices, and protocols, it also means then that any of the vulnerabilities in those products can be exploited in the electric sector. You know, we all laugh about Microsoft and Microsoft Office and their various products, but these commercial tools are now being used in the electric sector. On the other side, the IT and telecommunications sectors have had decades to address these vulnerabilities, how to fix them, how to move forward with them. And so we need to take advantage of the tools, techniques, and lessons that they have learned on how to deal with this. Some of the difficulties with the electric sector, as I'm sure you all know, is you can't do Patch Tuesday or Patch Thursday as you typically do in the IT and telecommunications sector. Patches in the electric sector need to be tested and to ensure that they do not adversely impact the operational systems. This can take 6 months, a year, 2 years. So when we overlay the IT and telecommunication infrastructures on the electric sector, there are a number of issues that we have to work out, and the speaker earlier talked about that the primary security objective for most IT and telecommunication systems is confidentiality, with integrity second and availability third. For the electric sector, that is not the case. The primary security objective is availability. The second objective, availability and integrity, those are tightly connected. The third is confidentiality. Confidentiality is critically important at the advanced metering infrastructure and a couple of the other subdomains, but primarily it's integrity and availability. So the security controls and the security requirements that you define for the electric sector and also many of the other critical infrastructures focus on integrity and availability. And that means a number of the standards that are out there that are used internationally, the ISO standards, they focus on IT and telecom. And this is why when I was in the federal government, we put the NIST interagency report together and focus on the electric sector. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about risk management and assessment and how you do this for the electric sector. And one thing, I do get asked this, okay, which one do I use? What's out there? What's the best one? There are many risk management frameworks that are out there. The U.S. has several. NIST has one. There are a couple of excellent documents that have been produced by the EU on risk management and how you do this. The best approach is to identify one and use it. The highest level risk management framework really should be at a very high level. And most organizations have a risk management framework. Don't just go out there and believe you need to start over. They are typically for the IT and communications systems. Start with those. Use what is in your organization and tailor it for the control systems and the control devices in the electric sector. Again, use what is in organizations. All organizations make risk decisions. No organization has unlimited funds to address all of the risks. Every organization has to prioritize the risks and then make decisions about which are the highest priority and then how they want to address them. And even if you prioritize them, again, organizations do not have unlimited funds to spend millions and millions on every risk. You need to prioritize them, figure out a time frame for how you're going to mitigate the different risks. And there also may be risks that you decide you're going to accept, that when you look at the residual risk, it is just not that important to the organization and it's too expensive to mitigate it. Again, there's no single list of systems that is applicable across all utilities. Every utility needs to define its own list of systems, and some of that will be defined on which parts of the domain of the grid you've implemented, whether it's you have transmission, generation down to distribution and the customer, if it's end-to-end, or if you just do distribution, or if you just do transmission and generation. You need to develop your own list. Okay, next slide. And I have just a high-level overview on risk assessment methodology. I'm sure a number of you have seen various diagrams. This is really just a standard risk assessment methodology that can apply to any organization and any part of the organization. So this is applicable to the IT, telecommunications, and electric sector infrastructure. First thing you have to do is identify your assets. And when I talked on the previous slide, identifying your various systems, that's what you're doing. Then to identify the threats. For example, in the U.S., the larger utilities are worried about nation states and terrorists. Smaller utilities, the smaller municipalities and co-ops are typically not worried about nation states. They are not large enough to be a target. Every organization has to define their threats. Then you look at the various vulnerabilities. You identify what those are, identify the impact, the threat likelihood assessment, and that's in parentheses there because depending on the particular threat and the impact, regardless of the likelihood you are going to mitigate it. For example, if you have a nuclear facility, regardless of the likelihood of the threat, you are going to significantly protect that nuclear facility. That's just not an option for anybody. So the threat likelihood really needs to be looked at in the context of the type of system that you're looking at. Then you do a risk assessment. You decide whether the risk is acceptable. And then if not, you identify your security controls. Okay, next slide, please. Now, one thing that is different for the electric sector, and particularly for the legacy equipment, it operates 24/7, 365 days a year. You generally do not bring it down unless you have to for some type of repair, and you do not adjust the various devices unless absolutely necessary. As I said earlier, as we move forward and integrate the IT and telecommunication infrastructures into the electric sector, turning devices on and just leaving them is not an option anymore. Because of the threat environment, the changing threat environment, the changing vulnerabilities, the new tools and products that are out there, you can't just turn it on and let it go. So you have to do ongoing monitoring. This does not mean that you have to assess every system all the time. You identify what your high priority systems are, and then you do ongoing monitoring. This is very different and very difficult for the electric sector. When you look at the operational devices, this is a very different approach. You have to figure out how to do it. Again, this is utilities need to look at, okay, what are the high priority systems? What do you focus your efforts and work on? Okay, next slide. Tips, and I've said these earlier, but this is just a high-level overview. You need to prioritize the security controls and focus on the highest impact systems. Pick those first. And when you identify your security requirements, you may look out there and say the tools and products are not available. And particularly for the electric sector, there's a lot of development that's going on, but not all the tools are available. So you may have to revise your list. And as I said, there's a constant changing environment of threats and vulnerabilities. We all see the news reports and articles about threats and vulnerabilities. This is a continuous, ongoing process, but you need to do your risk assessment constantly. Okay, next slide. Guidelines. I mentioned the document. It's the Guidelines for Smart Grid Cybersecurity. It's the National Institute of Standards and Technology Interagency Report 7628. It was posted August 2010. It was led by NIST. At the time, I was at NIST and led that effort. There was coordination, as you see, among all these different groups, and it was truly an international effort. There were representatives from utilities, vendors, and research organizations literally around the world. The intent was to take existing documents, not starting over, but taking existing documents, tailoring them for the electric sector with the focus on integrity and availability. It's a guideline. I say that over and over. It is a guideline. It is not a mandatory document. It is not a regulation. In there are security requirements. We couldn't think what else to call them, and I said they really are security requirements. But what they are useful for is it's a list to go through. You look at your systems. You look at the different systems or logical interface categories as defined in the NIST 7628. You look at the security requirements that have been selected, and it is to help you figure out what's applicable to your system. I know a number of utilities have said, well, I went through and I looked at this logical interface category, and gee, this requirement doesn't fit our organization, and we added this one. That is the whole intent. It is to be guidance. It's always easier to look at a document rather than just saying, gee, where do we start, and staring at a blank piece of paper. Okay, next slide. How the document was developed, the group looked at a number of use cases, and I'm sure you know there are thousands of use cases out there. And then just put a high level, what are the different systems, a high level risk assessment. And this risk assessment focused on identifying security requirements. As I mentioned earlier, risk assessment, several stages in the life cycle. You do it on developing requirements, but then you do it for selecting security controls and ongoing monitoring. There was also privacy assessment done. I highlighted the three in the bottom. Those were not included in the NIST. There is a high-level architecture diagram. It is not specific to any utility, and neither the countermeasures or assessment of security controls. They are talked about in the document, but those are done specific in each organization. Next slide. And I'm just going to walk through this, and I'm sure this diagram, we affectionately called it the spaghetti diagram, and I'm sure you can see why. It is very difficult to see. It is in the NIST. It includes all of the logical interface categories. I don't expect anybody to really be able to read a lot of the detail. But the idea was at a logical, and this is, again, it's a logical architecture that's in the NIST document. It is not intended to be any physical implementation. So, for example, some of these, when they reference PMU or EMS, that is at a logical level. There could be multiple devices that fall in there and a specific architecture, but the idea was to show the interconnections. This is a starting point. It is not, again, intended to be a physical implementation, and each organization needs to look at this as a starting point and see how it maps to your various systems. Steps in the process, and I'll just go through these quickly. I said you need to look at the systems, identify the interfaces and the subsystems. Practical guidance, and I do get asked is how many systems, and you see, I say one system is too few and 2,000 is probably too many. You need to be realistic about the systems that you identify because the security requirements are allocated to systems. And that means also that within a system, you may have some of the components that do not have any security functionality at all. And you may have other ones that have significant functionality, security functionality. So when you define your systems, be careful how you do that. If you have one system, there's just no way you could reasonably do all the requirements. You have 2,000 systems, you're going to be a lot of security requirements. It requires time and patience, and again, it's just you need to be very methodical as you go forward. Okay, next slide. Determine the impact level. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. When the team first started looking at the impact levels for each logical interface category, I think typically it was high across confidentiality, integrity, and availability for every logical interface category. That is not realistic. It's way too expensive. Be realistic about it. And again, focus on your most critical systems. The other important factor, and this is different from how the U.S. federal government operates, is, for example, if you are high in integrity for a system, that does not mean you have to be high in confidentiality or availability. It requires additional effort when you're looking at your systems, but it means you can have lower level controls. Otherwise, all of the controls will get very expensive. And prioritize your requirements. Okay, next slide. This is just what's in each of the requirements. Again, it's guidance document. There's descriptions, the impact level, and so on, just to provide practical information on what is in each security requirement. Next slide. And then what you need to do for this, the requirements provided in GRC, which is the governance, risk, and compliance, those are typically at the policy and procedures level, and those are typically going to apply to all of the systems. The common technical requirements are typically going to apply across all of the systems. Then there are some specific, unique technical requirements that are allocated to the different logical interface categories. Those are the ones you really want to look at because those are really the very detailed technical controls for each one of the logical interface categories. And for all of these, you modify them or tailor them as you need it. There are also some requirements in the NISTR that are not assigned to any of the logical interface categories. It is a catalog of requirements, and you may look at some of the other ones and decide that you need to include them. Now, what I put together last year, a document, I included the URL. It really is a horrendous URL on cybersecurity strategy guidance for the electric sector. The material I presented today is extracted from that document. This strategy guidance walks through all of this. The document is freely available. So please download it and use it. The intent was to provide an overview. The NISTR document, if you have not looked at it, it's 3 volumes and it's 600 pages. It's very daunting to go through it. Volume 1 is the architecture and requirements. Volume 2 is privacy. And Volume 3 is all of the supporting details. And I tell people Volume 3 is for people like me, the geeks in the room that like that. But it really provides the detailed analysis that was used to support Volume 1. This EPRI document is high level. I think it's about 40 pages. It provides an overview, as I said, what I walked through this morning, and it can help you go through all this material. I know this is a lot that I've thrown at people every day. On the last slide, you have my contact, email information here, and my telephone number if you need to get a hold of me. And I'll pass this on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Annabelle, for logging in so early and guiding us with your nice presentation.